The words came at me like a slap across a silent room. Clear your desk by noon and leave the company laptop. You won't be needing it where you're going. Marcus Whitfield did not bother to look up from his phone when he said it. He was leaning against the doorframe of my office, the office I had built from a converted supply closet 6 years ago, scrolling through messages like he was waiting for an Uber, not ending someone's career. His thumb moved lazily across the screen. His posture was casual, almost bored. The fluorescent light caught the edge of his designer watch, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a man who had never closed a single deal could afford something worth more than my car. "I'm sorry, what?" I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised even me. "You heard me?" He finally glanced up, and there it was, that smirk, the one he wore like a family crest. "Restructuring, your department's being absorbed, we're bringing in fresh talent. Younger, more adaptable." The silence in the hallway behind him was suffocating. I could see three junior analysts pretending to stare at their screens, their fingers frozen above their keyboards. The door to human resources 15 feet away stayed firmly closed. Nobody was coming to explain. Nobody was coming to help. This had been decided somewhere above me, in rooms I was never invited to, by people who had never once asked my opinion on anything that mattered. My name is Vivian Ashford. I am 34 years old, and until 11 seconds before that moment, I was the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Whitfield Crane Capital, a mid-sized investment firm that manages $2.3 billion in client assets. I had been there for 9 years. I started as an unpaid intern, fetching coffee for people who could not spell fiduciary. I built the client retention system that saved this company during the 2019 liquidity crisis, when half our competitors were hemorrhaging accounts and the partners were too paralyzed to return phone calls. I personally managed relationships with 6 of our top 10 institutional investors. Relationships I had cultivated over hundreds of dinners, hospital visits, and funerals. I knew the names of their children. I knew which ones were struggling with addiction, which ones had just become grandparents, which ones needed a quiet phone call on the anniversary of a spouse's death. Marcus Whitfield was the CEO's nephew. He was 28 years old. He held an MBA from a school his family had donated a library to, and he had been head of talent strategy for 11 months, a title that had been invented specifically so he could have one. He had never closed a deal. He had never kept a client. He had never stayed past 5:30 in the evening. And he had just fired me. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not give him the satisfaction of watching me unravel. I simply nodded, slowly, and turned toward my desk. Someone had already placed a single cardboard box by my door. They had planned this. They had the box ready before he even walked down the hallway. My hands were steady as I began placing things inside. A small jade plant I had kept alive for 7 years, a framed photograph of my parents at their anniversary party, a coffee mug with a chipped handle that said, "World's Okayest Strategist," a gift from a colleague who had left 2 years earlier. My hands did not shake. My face remained neutral. But inside, somewhere deep beneath the surface professionalism, something cold and patient was waking up. Whitfield Crane was founded by 2 families. The Whitfields brought money, connections, and the kind of social pedigree that opened doors in Manhattan. The Cranes brought operational genius and quiet discipline. Henry Crane, the original co-founder, died 4 years ago after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. I had visited him in the hospital 17 times during his final months. His daughter, Eleanor, sold her shares to the Whitfield side shortly after his death and disappeared to Switzerland. That was the official story. That was what everyone believed. What nobody knew, not Marcus, not his uncle Gregory Whitfield, not even the board, was that Eleanor Crane had not sold all her shares. She had kept 19%, and she had given power of attorney over those shares to one person, me. I finished packing my box and walked toward the elevator. My heels clicked against the marble floor in a rhythm I had memorized years ago. I passed the conference room where I had once presented a strategy that saved us $40 million in potential client losses. I passed the kitchen where I had made small talk with nervous interns, trying to make them feel less invisible. I passed the glass wall of Gregory Whitfield's corner office, where he sat with his back to me, already on to the next meeting. As I approached the elevator, Marcus called out from behind me, "Oh, and Vivian, Derek asked me to tell you he'll be moving his things out of your apartment this weekend. Said it's better if you're not there." I stopped. Derek, my fiancé of 2 years, Marcus's fraternity brother from their undergraduate days at Dartmouth, the man who had proposed to me on a rooftop in Brooklyn, with a ring I later learned he had bought with a loan from his mother. The man who had told me, just last month, that he could not wait to start our life together. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside without turning around. I pressed the button for the lobby. I watched the numbers descend, and somewhere between the 40th floor and the ground, I made a decision. So that is how it is. The apartment was quiet when I arrived home. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after something has already happened. I knew before I opened the door that Derek would be there. His car was parked in its usual spot. His gym bag was sitting on the front steps, already packed. He was in the bedroom when I walked in, pulling shirts from hangers with the careful efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked relieved, actually, as if my presence gave him permission to finally say what he had been practicing. "Viv, I wasn't expecting you so early." "I got fired." "I know." He did not even have the decency to pretend. "Marcus told me this morning." I stood in the doorway and watched him fold a sweater I had bought him for Christmas. The tag was still on it. He had never worn it. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, not meeting my eyes. "About us. About where things are going. And I realized that I need to be with someone who's going somewhere. Your career instability has made me reconsider our future." Career instability. I had been employed at the same company for 9 years. I had been promoted 4 times. I had a corner office and a title that took me half a decade to earn. But in his mind, the moment Marcus Whitfield decided I was disposable, I became unstable. "I see. It's nothing personal, Viv. It's just I got promoted senior associate, and the firm just landed Whitfield Crane as a client. It's a big opportunity for me. I can't have anything complicated attached to my name right now." The connection became sickeningly clear. Derek had traded me for a partnership track. He had weighed our relationship against a corner office and found me wanting. I wondered how long he had known this was coming. I wondered if he had helped make it happen. "I'll need the ring back," he said, finally looking at me. "It was my grandmother's, technically." I slid it off my finger without a word and placed it on the dresser beside him. He picked it up quickly, as if he were afraid I might change my mind. "I hope there are no hard feelings," he said. I did not answer. I simply walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I heard him finish packing. I heard his footsteps move toward the door. I heard him pause, as if waiting for me to say something, to cry, to beg. "Goodbye, Derek." The door clicked shut behind him. The apartment settled into silence. I sat on the kitchen floor, my back against the refrigerator, and stared at the ceiling. The water glass was cold in my hand. The light from the window cut across the tile in long, angular shadows. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply sat there and let the weight of the day settle around me like a coat I had not chosen to wear. They all think I am finished. The thought arrived quietly, without drama. It was not a question. It was not a fear. It was an observation, cold and clear, like reading a financial statement. A slow, dangerous calm settled over me. I finished the water. I stood up. I opened my laptop and navigated to a folder I had not touched in 3 years, buried beneath layers of old tax documents and archived correspondence. The folder was labeled Estate Documents, Crane. Inside were files Eleanor Crane had sent me before leaving the country. Files I had accepted without fully understanding their weight. Files I had kept because Henry Crane had asked me to. Because he had trusted me in ways his own family did not. 19% of voting shares, proxy authorization, and a clause buried in the original partnership agreement that nobody remembered existed, the Legacy Continuity Clause. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. If any single shareholder or their authorized proxy held 15% or more and believed the company was being materially mismanaged, they could demand a formal board review and temporarily freeze executive decisions pending an independent audit. Eleanor had trusted me with this because I was the only person who had treated her father with dignity in his final years. I had visited Henry Crane in the hospital when his own partners did not bother to send flowers. I had sat with him while he talked about his regrets, his hopes for the company, his fear that the Whitfields would destroy everything he had built. He had asked me to watch over things. He had asked me to be patient. I had not understood what he meant until now. The Whitfields never knew about this arrangement. They had assumed Eleanor was bitter and irrelevant, a grieving daughter who had cashed out and disappeared. They had dismissed her the same way they had dismissed me. They were wrong. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I had not used in years. Eleanor Crane, Zurich. My thumb hovered over the message icon. For a moment I hesitated. This was a line I could not uncross. Once I reached out, once I set this in motion, there would be no going back to the quiet life of corporate anonymity I had built for myself. I thought about Marcus's smirk. I thought about Derek's rehearsed speech. I thought about the cardboard box they had prepared before they even told me I was being let go. I typed, "They made their move. I think it's time I made mine." The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Eleanor was awake. Eleanor was waiting. Then, "I've been waiting for this. What do you need?" For 3 weeks, I existed in deliberate silence. I did not update my LinkedIn profile. I did not send out resumes. I did not respond to the handful of sorry to hear the news messages that trickled in from former colleagues, their sympathy thin and cautious, as if my misfortune might be contagious. Instead, I worked, quietly, methodically, the way I had always worked when something important needed to be done. My apartment became a command center of sorts. The dining table disappeared beneath stacks of documents, printouts, and color-coded folders. My laptop ran constantly, its fan whirring through the night as I cross-referenced files and built timelines. I survived on coffee and delivery, noodles sleeping in short bursts when my eyes refused to focus. I had retained copies of 9 years of internal emails, contracts, and client files. This was standard practice for senior directors, a way to protect yourself in case of disputes or audits. The Whitfields, in their arrogant haste to remove me, had never bothered to revoke my access properly. My credentials still worked for 3 days after my termination. By the time IT finally locked me out, I had already downloaded everything I needed. What I found was worse than I expected. Marcus Whitfield had been making unauthorized promises to 3 major institutional clients. He had guaranteed specific returns, numbers that Whitfield Crane could not legally guarantee without violating securities regulations. One client, a pension fund called Ridgeway Municipal Trust, had received a formal performance projection with Marcus's signature at the bottom. The projected returns were 14% over 18 months. The actual portfolio performance was tracking at 6% at best. This was not incompetence. This was securities fraud. And Marcus's name was on every document. I printed the evidence. I created encrypted backups on 2 separate drives. I stored one in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. Then I waited. I understood something that Marcus and his family did not. Exposing this too early would look exactly like what they would claim it was: a disgruntled employee's revenge. I would be painted as bitter, unhinged, motivated by personal vendetta rather than genuine concern. The Whitfields had resources, they had lawyers, they had the ability to spin any narrative they wanted. I needed leverage to accumulate. I needed them to dig their own grave deeper before I handed them the shovel. So I watched. I waited. I let the silence grow around me like armor. During those weeks, I learned more about Gregory Whitfield than I had in 9 years of working under him. Gregory was not stupid exactly. He had a certain cunning when it came to self-preservation, but he was lazy and complacent. He had inherited control of the firm after his older brother died in a sailing accident, and he had coasted ever since, relying on the company's legacy reputation to paper over his lack of vision. He protected Marcus not out of love. I doubted Gregory was capable of that, but out of family obligation and fear. Marcus's mother, Diane Whitfield, sat on the board and controlled a significant personal stake in the company. She was the real power behind the throne. A woman who had never worked a day in her life, but believed with absolute certainty that her bloodline entitled her to control the lives of those who did. Gregory answered to her. Everyone answered to her. The Whitfields believed they were untouchable. They had never faced a real challenge because no one had ever stayed long enough to mount one. Employees came and went. Clients were inherited, not earned. The company ran on momentum, on reputation, on the lingering trust that Henry Crane had built before he died. I knew every crack in their foundation. I had helped build the systems they now took for granted. I had written the procedures they ignored, trained the staff they undervalued, maintained the relationships they exploited. They thought they could discard me like an outdated piece of software. They had no idea what I was capable of. On the 21st day, my phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a number I recognized. Priya Menon. She had been a risk analyst at Whitfield Crane for 4 years, quiet and competent, one of the few people who had never treated me like a stepping stone. Something's wrong here. They're hiding things from the board. Can we talk? I replied. Name the place. The alliance was beginning. Priya chose a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from the gleaming towers of the financial district. It was a small place with mismatched furniture and baristas who looked like they had never heard of quarterly earnings reports. The kind of place where no one from Whitfield Crane would ever think to look. She was already seated when I arrived, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. She looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes told me she had not been sleeping well. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down. "Thank you for reaching out." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what we were about to discuss settling between us like an uninvited guest. "Things have gotten bad since you left," she said finally. "Really bad. They gutted the compliance department, brought in Marcus's college roommate, Trent Holloway, as the new head of compliance. He has no regulatory experience. His main qualification seems to be that he once helped Marcus cheat on an economics exam. I'm not surprised. There's more." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of screenshots. "I've been noticing discrepancies in the quarterly reports. Numbers that don't add up. Client funds moving between accounts without proper documentation. I tried to raise concerns through the proper channels, but Trent told me I was being hysterical and that I should focus on my own work." "Did you document that conversation?" "Every word." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I recognized. The frustration of being dismissed, the fear of speaking up, the quiet rage of knowing you are right and having no one believe you. "Marcus mocked my accent in a meeting last week," she said, her voice dropping. "Told me to speak American. Everyone laughed. No one said anything." I reached across the table and placed my hand on hers. "I'm sorry. That should never have happened. I'm not looking for sympathy." Her jaw tightened. "I'm looking for a way to fight back. I considered my options. Carefully, I could not recruit her. Not yet. The timing was wrong, and I could not risk exposing my plans before they were ready. But I could offer her something else: protection, hope. If you ever need to leave, I said, I'll make sure you have somewhere to land. But for now, stay inside, watch, and document everything. Everything? Everything. Emails, meetings, conversations, dates and times, names and witnesses. Build a record. Store it somewhere safe. And keep me informed. She nodded slowly. What are you planning? Something that requires patience and allies. We finished our tea in silence. When we parted, she looked less afraid. Not confident, not yet, but less alone. Over the following days, I learned that Priya was not the only one suffering. Several mid-level employees had been forced out or sidelined since my departure. The institutional knowledge was bleeding out of the firm like water from a cracked pipe. Client calls were going unreturned. A major healthcare fund had already begun, quietly inquiring about moving their assets elsewhere. The Whitfields did not notice. They were too busy congratulating Marcus on his bold leadership restructuring, too busy planning his next promotion, too busy admiring their own reflections in the glass walls of their corner offices. 3 days after my meeting with Priya, I received an unexpected email. The sender was Martin Greaves, director of Ridgeway Municipal Trust. The subject line read, "Regarding our account, urgent concerns." They were not writing to Whitfield Crane. They were writing to me, personally. Old habits, old trust. I smiled for the first time in 3 weeks. Martin Greaves answered on the second ring. His voice was the same as I remembered. Measured, thoughtful. The kind of voice that made you want to tell the truth. Vivian, thank you for taking my call. Of course, Martin, how can I help? There was a pause on the line. I could hear him choosing his words carefully. The numbers Marcus sent us don't match anything we've seen before. And when I asked for clarification, he told me to trust the process. Vivian, I've never heard anyone at your firm speak to me like that. I did not badmouth Marcus or the Whitfields. I simply listened. I asked clarifying questions. I let Martin tell me what he was seeing, what he was feeling, what he was afraid might be happening to the pension fund he had protected for 30 years. Ridgeway Municipal Trust served 40,000 public school teachers, firefighters, and municipal workers. These were not wealthy investors playing games with disposable income. These were ordinary people who had spent their careers serving their communities, trusting that their retirements would be safe. If Marcus's fraud was real and unchecked, those people could lose everything. Would it help if I reviewed the documents they sent you? I asked. Personally, off the record. Just to give you a second opinion. That's what I was hoping you'd say. He emailed them to me that afternoon. I spent 4 hours going through every page, every projection, every footnote. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. Not with fear, with anger. The numbers were fabricated. Not subtly, not cleverly, crudely. Marcus had simply inflated the projected returns by 30%, added language about proprietary strategies, and signed his name at the bottom like he was authorizing a lunch order. He had not even bothered to align the figures with the actual portfolio holdings. Anyone with a basic understanding of investment mathematics could see the discrepancies. This was not about revenge anymore. This was about responsibility. I called Eleanor that night. The connection crackled slightly. Zurich to New York. But her voice was clear. It's worse than we thought. This isn't just incompetence, it's criminal. Then we don't just remove them, she said. We rebuild the entire structure, and we do it properly. She told me about the 2 independent board members she had maintained quiet relationships with over the years. Walter Ingram, a retired federal prosecutor who had served on the board since her father's time. Catherine Solis, a former CFO of a Fortune 500 company who had been systematically marginalized by the Whitfields, but never formally removed. Both had been loyal to Henry Crane. Both had been waiting for someone to stand up. If I invoked the legacy continuity clause and Eleanor returned to demand a board review, those two votes could tip the balance. The chessboard was forming. I could see the moves now, stretching out ahead of me like a path through fog. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I had not expected to see again. Derek. Hey, can we talk? I think I made a mistake. I read it once. Then I deleted it. No, you made a choice. Choices have consequences. Marcus, perhaps sensing minor tremors of discontent among the staff, decided to throw what he called a company culture reset event. In practice, this meant a lavish rooftop party at one of Manhattan's most expensive venues, complete with an open bar, a celebrity DJ, and gift bags worth more than most employees' monthly grocery budgets. The official purpose was to boost morale and celebrate the new era of Whitfield Crane. The real purpose was to reinforce Marcus's image as a visionary leader and remind everyone who controlled their paychecks. I was not invited, of course, but Priya attended and sent me live updates throughout the evening. The party was everything I expected. Champagne towers, past hors d'oeuvres, junior analysts trying too hard to impress people who would never remember their names. Marcus held court in the center of it all, surrounded by sycophants and family friends, gesturing expansively as he described his plans for transforming the firm's culture. At 9:30, he gave a speech. Priya recorded it on her phone. "We're entering a new chapter," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular blend of confidence and condescension that came naturally to people who had never earned anything. A chapter defined by boldness, by innovation, by a willingness to move past the old guard who couldn't adapt to the changing marketplace. Several employees shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances. One senior accountant, a quiet man named Harold Ing, who had been with the company for 18 years, excused himself and left early. Later that night, I received an email from Harold. "I don't know what you're planning, but count me in." I stared at the message for a long time. Harold Eng, the company's controller, a man who knew where every dollar went, who had signed off on every report, who had been quietly keeping the books balanced while Marcus and his family played at being executives. He was scared. The tone of his email made that clear. But he was also angry. And that anger had finally outweighed his fear. I wrote back, "Thank you. We'll talk soon." The people who built this company, the quiet, competent, overlooked ones, were starting to find each other. For the first time since Marcus had told me to clear my desk, I felt the first flicker of something I had not allowed myself in months: hope. 2 days later, Gregory Whitfield called an emergency leadership meeting. Priya texted me, "Something's happening. They're panicking about something. I'll find out what." 2 hours later, she called. The SEC sent a preliminary inquiry letter. Someone reported the fraudulent projections. I sat up straighter. "Who?" "I don't know. It wasn't me. It wasn't you, right?" "No." Someone else had filed the report. Someone with access. Someone who had seen what I had seen and decided not to wait. The fire was spreading faster than expected, and I was not the only one holding matches. The Whitfield family went into full crisis mode within hours of receiving the SEC letter. Gregory canceled all external meetings and locked himself in his office with the company's general counsel. Diane Whitfield flew in from her home in Greenwich, her arrival announced by the sharp click of her heels echoing through the executive floor like a warning shot. Gregory's first move was to hire an outside law firm to handle the SEC inquiry. The firm he chose was Harrington and Associates, one of the most expensive and least ethical practices in the city. They specialized in making problems disappear through a combination of procedural obstruction, strategic delays, and aggressive intimidation of witnesses. The lead partner on the case was a man named Richard Harrington III. The junior associate assigned to assist him was Derek. I learned this from Priya, who had overheard a conversation in the break room. My former fiancé was now being paid to protect the people who had ended my career. The irony was almost too perfect to be coincidental. Marcus, desperate to find a scapegoat, began reviewing old employee files with the fervor of a man who knew he was guilty and needed someone else to blame. He pulled performance reviews, exit interviews, termination records. He was looking for anyone he could point to, anyone he could sacrifice to protect himself. And he landed on me. Within days, rumors began circulating through the office. Vivian Ashford was unstable. Vivian Ashford was bitter. Vivian Ashford had probably filed the SEC complaint herself. Vivian Ashford had stolen client data before leaving. Vivian Ashford had always been jealous of Marcus's success. The Whisper campaign was sophisticated in its simplicity. Marcus did not make these accusations directly. That would leave a trail. Instead, he mentioned things casually in meetings, raised concerns in passing, asked leading questions that planted seeds of doubt. Did anyone notice anything strange about Vivian's behavior before she left? I wonder who had access to those projection documents. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? I heard about the smear campaign from Priya, who had been present when Marcus made a particularly pointed comment during a team meeting. For a moment when she told me, I felt the old wound reopen. The injustice of being blamed for someone else's failures. The familiar sting of having my reputation attacked by people who had never done a fraction of what I had done for that company. But then I steadied myself. Let them talk. Let them point fingers at shadows. While they chase ghosts, I will be preparing the real reckoning. I continued my work. I refined my documentation. I coordinated with Eleanor on the timing of our move. The SEC inquiry was actually helping us. It created pressure. It made the Whitfields desperate. It forced them into mistakes they would never have made if they had felt secure. Derek, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had gotten himself into. As a junior associate on the case, he was responsible for reviewing thousands of pages of internal documents. He was seeing Marcus's signatures on the fraudulent projections. He was seeing the discrepancies in the quarterly reports. He was seeing the emails that proved the compliance department had been gutted specifically to prevent oversight. And he was realizing, slowly and painfully, that the woman he had abandoned was the only person who could have protected him from being associated with this disaster. His conscience was beginning to crack. My phone rang one evening. Derek's number. I did not answer. He left a voicemail. Viv, I need to talk to you, please. This is serious. I think I'm in over my head. I listened to it once. Then I saved it. Evidence. If I need it. Zurich in November was gray and cold, the kind of weather that made you want to stay inside with strong coffee and difficult decisions. I met Eleanor Crane at a restaurant overlooking the lake, the water flat and metallic under the overcast sky. She looked exactly as I remembered, elegant, sharp-eyed, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had walked away from power by choice, not defeat. Her hair was silver now, cut short in a way that emphasized the angles of her face. She wore simple clothes, expensive but understated. She looked like what she was, a woman who had nothing left to prove. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down. "Thank you for waiting." We ordered wine and spoke carefully at first, feeling our way back into a relationship that had been mostly epistolary for 3 years. She asked about my health, my apartment, whether I was eating properly. I asked about her life in Zurich, her work with a foundation that funded education programs for refugees, whether she had found the peace she had been seeking when she left. Then we got to business. "The SEC inquiry changes the timeline," I said. "We need to move faster than I originally planned." "I agree. I've already booked a flight back to New York. I'll arrive next Tuesday." "And Walter and Catherine." "Both confirmed. They've been waiting for this moment longer than you know. Walter, especially. He never forgave Gregory for how they treated my father at the end." We spent the next 2 hours finalizing our strategy. Eleanor would return to the United States and formally invoke the legacy continuity clause. I, as her authorized proxy, would present the evidence of mismanagement to the board. the two independent board members would support the motion for an independent review. The Whitfields would have no choice but to submit to an audit. And once the auditors saw what we had documented, the house of cards would collapse. My father always said the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. Eleanor said as we finished our meal, "You reminded him of himself. That's why he trusted you." I felt the weight of that legacy settle around my shoulders, not as a burden, as armor. On the flight back to New York, I received a message from an unknown number. "I know what you're planning. Be careful. They're already talking about suing you." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Someone on the inside knew. Someone was watching. But they had not tried to stop me. They had warned me. I did not recognize the sender, but I filed the number away for later. Not everyone in that building was my enemy. I returned to New York with renewed focus. The final preparations consumed every waking hour. Harolding, the controller, worked with me to compile a secure, time-stamped evidence package documenting every fraudulent transaction and false report Marcus had authorized. We met in secret, in locations far from the office, exchanging encrypted files and verifying signatures. Harold was methodical and precise, the kind of accountant who took personal offense at improperly categorized expenses. The fraud in those documents offended him on a cellular level. Priya provided internal communication logs, showing Marcus explicitly instructing employees to adjust projections to meet client expectations. She had been collecting them for weeks, screenshot by screenshot, date by date. Her documentation was immaculate. Martin Greaves, at my gentle suggestion, officially requested a formal review of his pension fund's account. This was a routine request that any client was entitled to make, but the timing was deliberate. Under Whitfield Crane's own bylaws, such a request had to be presented to the board within 30 days. It created a forcing function, a deadline that the Whitfields could not postpone. The walls were closing in, and they did not even know it yet. The night before the board meeting, I sat alone in my apartment. The city lights flickered beyond my window. The evidence binder sat on my coffee table, perfectly organized, every tab in place. I had reviewed it 100 times. I knew every page by heart. I picked up a photograph I had kept in a drawer for years. Myself at 25, bright-eyed and nervous, shaking hands with Henry Crane on my first day at the firm. He was smiling in the photograph, genuinely smiling, with the kind of warmth that executives rarely showed to junior employees. He had seen something in me that day. Potential, maybe? Or just someone who reminded him of himself before the money and the politics had complicated everything. "I won't let them destroy what you built," I whispered to the empty room. The words hung in the silence like a promise. I learned the next morning that Marcus, sensing danger, had tried to preemptively fire Priya and Harold. He had ordered HR to process their terminations immediately, claiming performance concerns that did not exist in any documented record. But I had anticipated this. Both Priya and Harold had formally documented their whistleblower status weeks earlier, filing reports with an independent attorney who specialized in employment law. Any retaliation now would trigger additional liability, not just for Marcus, but for the company as a whole. The Whitfields were running out of moves. Their pieces were falling off the board faster than they could replace them. That evening, Derek appeared at my door. He looked exhausted. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he had not slept properly in days. "Viv, please, can we talk?" I considered closing the door in his face. The temptation was real and satisfying to imagine. But I had learned something over the past months about the difference between emotion and strategy. Derek might still be useful. I stepped aside and let him in. He stood in my living room, looking around at the space that had once been ours, the furniture we had chosen together, the photographs I had not yet taken down. He seemed smaller than I remembered, less certain. "They're going to throw me under the bus," he said. "I'm the one who's going to take the fall for the cover-up. Richard Harrington told me today. They need someone to blame, and I'm the junior associate with no connections and no leverage. I'm aware. Please, Viv, help me. You're the only one who knows what's really going on. You're the only one who could, why should I? The question stopped him cold. He stared at me, and I watched the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was trying to figure out which version of me was standing in front of him. The woman who had loved him? The woman he had betrayed? The woman who might still have enough sentiment left to save him from his own choices? Because I made a mistake, he said finally. Because I was stupid and scared, and I let them convince me that you were the problem. I should have known better. I should have been better. Yes, you should have. I let the silence stretch. Let him feel the weight of it. I'm not going to save you, Derek. But I'm not going to destroy you either. You can walk away from this with your license intact, if you testify to what you know. Testify? The SEC is going to want witnesses. People who can explain what Harrington and Associates knew and when they knew it. You have first-hand knowledge of how the Whitfields are handling this inquiry. That information has value. They'll ruin me. They're already planning to ruin you. The only question is whether you go down fighting or let them push you off the cliff without resistance. He was quiet for a long time. I could see the fear in his eyes, and beneath it something that might have been the first stirrings of conscience. Okay, he said. I'll do it. I nodded and showed him to the door. He paused at the threshold. I really am sorry, Viv. I know, it doesn't change anything, but I know. Watching him leave, I felt no satisfaction, only clarity. He was never my enemy. He was just another person who had traded integrity for comfort and found the price too high. I did not hate him anymore. I just did not care. The morning of the board meeting arrived with the kind of crisp, clear November sky that made Manhattan look like a photograph of itself. The Whitfield Tower gleamed in the early light, its glass walls reflecting clouds and ambition in equal measure. The boardroom was on the 40th floor, a vast space designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. The conference table was polished mahogany, long enough to seat 20. At the head sat Gregory Whitfield, flanked by Marcus on his right and Diane on his left. The family united, or so they believed. The two independent board members, Walter Ingram and Catherine Solis, sat at the far end of the table. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but I caught Catherine's eye as I entered, and she gave me an almost imperceptible nod. The Whitfields expected a routine quarterly review. Gregory had prepared a presentation about strategic initiatives and growth opportunities. Marcus had brought slides about his restructuring success. Diane had worn her most expensive jewelry, a display of wealth meant to remind everyone present who really held power. Then Eleanor Crane walked in. The room froze. She had not set foot in this building since her father's funeral. Most of the people present had assumed she was living in permanent exile, irrelevant and forgotten. But here she was, striding through the door in a tailored gray suit, her silver hair catching the light, her expression calm and utterly composed. "Good morning," she said. "I apologize for the surprise, but I believe this meeting requires my presence." Gregory's face went pale. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Diane's perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the table. "Eleanor," Gregory managed, "what are you doing here?" "Exercising my rights as a shareholder." She took a seat at the table, directly across from Diane. "I hold 19% of the voting shares in this company, and I am formally invoking the Legacy Continuity Clause." The what? Article 7, Section 3 of the original partnership agreement. If any shareholder holding 15% or more believes the company is being materially mismanaged, they may demand a formal board review and freeze executive decisions pending an independent audit. That's ridiculous. That clause hasn't been used in 32 years. Since my father invoked it to stop your brother from selling off the pension management division, the clause remains valid and binding. She gestured toward the door. I entered carrying the evidence binder. Marcus's face drained of color. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely afraid. You remember Vivian Ashford? Eleanor said. My authorized proxy and the holder of detailed documentation regarding certain irregularities in recent company operations. I walked to the table and placed the binder in front of Gregory. I opened it to the first flag document, Marcus's signature on the fraudulent Ridgeway projection. You told me to clear my desk by noon, I said, looking at Marcus for the first time since he had fired me. I did, but I kept the receipts. The room was silent. I walked the board through the evidence, calmly, methodically. Each document, each signature, each discrepancy. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply presented the facts and let them speak for themselves. The fraudulent projections, the gutted compliance department, the retaliation against whistleblowers, the internal communications showing Marcus instructing employees to falsify reports, the SEC inquiry that was already underway. Walter Ingram listened with the focused intensity of the federal prosecutor he had once been. Catherine Solis took careful notes. The two Whitfield-aligned board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the documents and the family they had pledged to protect. Marcus tried to deflect. He blamed me. He blamed Priya. He blamed disloyal employees and corporate sabotage. His voice rose higher and higher, tinged with desperation. But the documents did not lie. Gregory Whitfield, finally understanding the scope of what his nephew had done, turned on Marcus. What did you do? Uncle Gregory, What did you do? The question hung in the air. Marcus had no answer. For once in his life, there was no one to protect him, no family connection to smooth things over, no title to hide behind. Walter Ingram cleared his throat. I move that Marcus Whitfield be suspended from all executive duties immediately, pending the completion of an independent audit. Catherine Solis seconded the motion. The vote was called, 3 in favor, 2 against. Gregory abstained, unwilling to vote against his own nephew, but unable to defend him. Marcus was finished. Diane Whitfield stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over, she said. I will destroy everyone involved in this coup. She swept out of the room, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. I watched her go. You cannot destroy what you never controlled. The weeks following the board meeting unfolded with the methodical inevitability of a legal process that had finally found momentum. The independent audit began immediately, conducted by a firm with no ties to the Whitfield family. The auditors were thorough and efficient. They found everything I had documented and more. The SEC investigation accelerated. Marcus Whitfield was formally charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to deceive investors. The charges carried potential prison time measured in decades. He was released on bail, ordered to surrender his passport, and banned from contacting any current or former employees of the company. Gregory Whitfield resigned as CEO 3 weeks after the board meeting. The resignation was technically voluntary, but the alternative, facing potential civil liability as an executive who was aware but inactive during the fraud, left him no choice. He released a carefully worded statement expressing full confidence in the board's judgment and announcing his intention to pursue other opportunities. Diane Whitfield's board seat was vacated after evidence surfaced that she had personally instructed subordinates to delete incriminating emails. The obstruction of justice charge was still pending when last I heard. Derek, true to his word, provided testimony to the SEC investigators. He explained what Harrington and Associates had known about the fraud and when they had known it. His cooperation saved his license, though his partnership track at the firm evaporated overnight. I watched the news coverage from my apartment: CNN, Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal. The story of Whitfield Crane's collapse became a business school case study within months. Marcus's face appeared on screen after screen, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and barely suppressed panic. I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. I simply made a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the city I had once thought had rejected me. They did not reject me. They just did not see me. The board, now controlled by Eleanor and the independent members, voted to restructure the firm entirely. Priya Menon was promoted to head of compliance, with full authority to rebuild the department from the ground up. Harold Eng was given a seat on the executive committee, recognition at last for 18 years of quiet, competent service, and I was offered the role of CEO. I declined. The title held no appeal for me. I had spent enough years watching executives lose themselves in the pursuit of corner offices and quarterly targets. I did not want to become another name on a letterhead, another face in a boardroom, another person whose worth was measured in titles and parking spaces. Instead, I proposed something different: chairwoman of strategic oversight, a non-operational role that gave me structural influence without the daily grind of management. I would advise. I would watch. I would ensure that the lessons of the Whitfield era were not forgotten. Eleanor agreed immediately. You've earned the right to choose your own title. Power on my terms. Finally. Derek reached out one final time, 3 months after the dust had settled. He wanted closure, he said. He wanted to understand how I had stayed so calm, so focused, so patient through everything that had happened. We met at a quiet restaurant in the village, far from the financial district and its memories. He looked better than the last time I had seen him. Rested, less afraid. He had left Harrington and Associates and taken a position with a nonprofit legal organization. Lower salary, but cleaner conscience. I need to know, he said after we had ordered. How did you do it? How did you keep going when everything was falling apart? I considered the question carefully before answering. I stopped waiting for other people to validate me. I stopped believing that my worth depended on their recognition. When you left, when Marcus fired me, when everyone assumed I was finished, I realized that I had been defining myself by my relationships to other people, my job, my engagement, my reputation in a company that never valued me. And then, I started defining myself by my own standards, by what I knew I was capable of, by what I had built, and what I could build again. He was quiet for a moment. I was a coward. I chose the easy path because I thought you'd always be there as a backup. I took you for granted. I nodded. You did, but I learned something important from you. What? That my value doesn't depend on someone else recognizing it. We finished our meal in comfortable silence. When the check came, I paid it, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a final statement. I was no longer waiting for him to make things right. I was no longer measuring myself against his choices. The wound was closed. Not healed exactly. Closed. And that was enough. In the months that followed, Marcus Whitfield became a cautionary tale. His name trended on LinkedIn as an example of nepotism's consequences. Business schools assigned his case in ethics courses. Podcasters dissected his rise and fall with the gleeful precision of cultural anthropologists studying a failed civilization. Diane Whitfield retreated from public life entirely. Her social standing demolished. She sold her Manhattan apartment and moved to a gated community in Arizona. I heard she spent most of her time now arguing with homeowners associations about landscaping regulations. Gregory Whitfield, broken, humiliated after the legal settlements depleted most of his personal wealth, relocated to a small town in Florida. The last I heard, he was working as a consultant for a regional bank, a job he presumably obtained through whatever remaining connections had not been severed by the scandal. I received a handwritten letter one morning, delivered by courier. The return address was Henry Crane's old estate, now managed by a historical trust that Eleanor had established in her father's memory. Inside, a single line in Eleanor's handwriting, "Father would be proud." I framed it. Whitfield Crane was officially renamed 6 months after the restructuring was complete. The new name was Crane Ashford Capital, a deliberate gesture honoring both the original legacy and the person who had preserved it. I attended the renaming ceremony, standing beside Eleanor on the small stage that had been erected in the main lobby. The Whitfield portraits had been removed from the walls, replaced by photographs of the company's earliest days. Henry Crane shaking hands with clients, the original office space in a cramped building downtown, the first employee roster with 17 names and handwritten annotations. Martin Greaves was there, representing Ridgeway Municipal Trust. He approached me after the ceremony, his weathered face creased with a smile. "My teachers and firefighters are sleeping easier now," he said. "Thank you." "Thank the auditors. They're the ones who fixed the numbers." "I'm thanking you. You're the one who cared enough to fight." We shook hands. His grip was firm and genuine, the handshake of someone who understood what loyalty actually meant. The firm's stock price, after an initial dip during the scandal, had stabilized and begun climbing. Institutional investors were returning. The market, it seemed, trusted competence. The Whitfield name had been quietly removed from the building, replaced by the new signage that gleamed in the morning light. As I walked through the new office, brighter, calmer, redesigned with input from employees who had actually worked in the old spaces, I paused at a window where I had once stood as an intern, 25 years old, invisible and eager, fetching coffee for people who never learned my name. I was not invisible anymore, but more importantly, I no longer needed to be seen. I built this, and I chose to stay. As I prepared to leave for the evening, a young woman approached me. She was new, nervous, clutching a notebook to her chest like a shield. An intern, I guessed. First week on the job. "Ms. Ashford, I just wanted to say I read about what happened, the whole story. You're the reason I applied here." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw myself 20 years ago, bright-eyed, uncertain, hoping desperately that someone would see potential worth nurturing. "Then make sure you build something worth protecting." She nodded, her eyes bright with the same hope I had once carried. And as she walked away, I realized that the revenge I had sought was never really about Marcus or the Whitfields. It was about proving to myself that I was more than the boxes they had tried to put me in. 6 months passed. Seasons changed. The city moved through summer into autumn, then into the cold clarity of another New York winter. My new office was smaller than the old one, by choice. I did not need a corner suite. I did not need floor-to-ceiling windows or imported furniture or any of the other trappings that executives used to convince themselves they mattered. I needed a window with good light and a door I could close when I wanted silence. That was enough. Eleanor visited from Zurich, one of her quarterly trips to check on the company and remind the board that she was watching. We shared coffee in my office, looking out at the city we had both, in our own ways, helped to save. "You know," she said, "you could have taken everything, the title, the visibility, the credit, the corner office and the expense account and the car service." I shrugged. I took what I needed: control, respect, peace. The rest was never the point. Father would have said the same thing. I know, that's why I said it. We laughed together, the easy laughter of two people who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Not unscathed. No one emerges from that kind of struggle without scars, but intact, stronger. That evening, after Eleanor had left for her hotel, I walked through Central Park. The trees were bare, their branches black against the fading winter light. The paths were quiet, most people driven indoors by the cold. I found myself at a bench I remembered, a bench where I had sat 6 months after my firing, staring at the sky, wondering if I would ever feel whole again. wondering if the people who had dismissed me were right, wondering if I was finished. I sat there now, in the same spot, but this time I was not lost. I was arrived. They thought silence was weakness. They learned it was patience. They thought invisibility was irrelevance. They learned it was strategy. They thought I was finished. They were wrong. The firm was thriving. The clients were secure. The people who had built the real foundation, the Prius and the Heralds, the quiet professionals who showed up every day and did their jobs without fanfare or recognition, were finally being valued. The culture was changing, slowly but measurably. New hires were chosen for competence, not connections. Promotions were based on performance, not pedigree. And the Whitfields? A footnote, a warning. A story told to remind ambitious climbers that titles are borrowed, but competence is earned. Marcus was awaiting trial, his lawyers filing motion after motion to delay the inevitable. I did not follow the coverage closely anymore. He was no longer relevant to my life. Diane had sent a threatening letter through her attorneys 3 months ago, promising to sue me for defamation, emotional distress, and a list of other claims that her lawyers had clearly invented to justify their fees. I forwarded the letter to our legal team and never heard about it again. Empty threats from an empty woman. Gregory had apparently found religion, according to an article I stumbled across online. He was attending a megachurch in Florida and had given an interview about his spiritual journey and lessons learned. I did not read it. Some stories do not deserve the attention. I looked up at the sky, the same sky I had stared at on my worst day. The clouds had shifted. The light was changing. Evening was settling over the city, but the sky did not look the same anymore, not because it had changed, because I had. I stood up from the bench and walked home through the winter evening. The cold air was sharp and clean. The city lights were beginning to flicker on. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. I thought about the young intern who had approached me earlier that day, the one who had applied because of my story. I hoped she would build something worth protecting. I hoped she would learn, as I had learned, that power is not given. It is taken quietly by people who refuse to be defined by others' limitations. I hoped she would find allies. I hoped she would document everything. I hoped she would wait with patience and strike with precision. And I hoped that if anyone ever told her to clear her desk by noon, she would nod calmly, pack her things with steady hands, and keep every single receipt. The apartment was warm when I arrived home. I made tea. I sat by the window. The city stretched out before me, millions of lights in millions of windows, millions of stories being written and rewritten every day. I was one of those stories now, not the ending I had imagined when I started. Better. They say that living well is the best revenge. I think that is partly true, but there is something even better than living well: building something that outlasts the people who tried to tear you down. I took a sip of tea and watched the night deepen over Manhattan. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt at peace.